So I did my presentation on labeling and regulations of GMOs. Some issues are some potential risk of GMO crops of human health are antibiotic resistance, allergicity, natural change, and the formation of toxins. So other cases such as toxicity, allergicity, and natural and horizontal transfers have been performed following a case-by-case approach, inserting newly emergent safeties, knowledge, and technology. The use of GMO crops has fed and reduced concerns around human safety and underlying other issues such as feeding values and natural advances. So also labeling is very broad and vague and ignores the actual traits introduced to the food, and the use of chemicals in crops vary considerably according to the local conditions. So some other issues also include cost, which depend on how much of the safety chain to be segregated for both domestic and export markets. Costs will also differ depending on the time frame for adoption of certification processes. Important issues ultimately benefit and in cost effectively labels provide information that consumers want, and consumers want to see, does it contain or may it contain on the labels. Effective labeling can facilitate product differentiation and effectant specialities of different segments of industries within or across countries that produce GMO products. Some other issues of concerns include the capability of GMOs to escape and potentially introduce the engineering genes into wild populations. The persistence of genes after the GMOs have been harvested, and the specificity of non-targeted organisms such as insects, which are not pests, to gene products. The stability of genes, the reduction in the spectrum of other plants include loss of biodiversity, and this is also the increase of the chemicals used in the agriculture of the crops. Some arguments of to support GMOs are the safety assessments that are focused on GMOs, direct health effects such as toxicity, potentially to provoke all allergic reactions, specific components thought to have natural or toxic properties, the stability of inserted genes, natural effects associated with GMOs, and some effects which could result from the gene insertions. Some arguments made against GMOs are labels. Labels on GMO foods, including warnings. They must be effective, whereas no variable differences in health effects between GMOs and conventional foods have been detected. If a natural differentiation or allergenic characteristics were found in the GMOs, current FDA regulations already require a label to that effect. Costs associated with labeling of GMO foods would be borne broadly by most consumers in order to fulfill the desire of some consumers. Consumers want to buy non-GMO foods, already have options to purchase verified non-GMO foods or certified organic foods. Some other arguments are experiences with mandatory labeling in countries such as the European Union, Japan, and New Zealand has not resulted in greater consumer choices. The food system infrastructure in these countries could not currently associate the need of segregation of GMOs and non-GMO products. So some more arguments to support GMOs are consumers have the right to know what their foods are, especially concerning ingredients for which they may be health and environmental concerns. Mandatory labeling will allow consumers to identify and steer clear of types of foods produced that they wish to avoid. So for some religious or ethical reasons, some Americans may want to avoid eating certain products that may be introduced by GMO methods. Voluntarily labeling has been sufficient for informing consumers about the presence of GMO ingredients. Surveys indicate that the majority of Americans support mandatory labeling, and at least 64 countries have established some of the mandatory labelings. So political concerns. GMOs introduced to the European market that produce the products were no benefit to the consumers. So since the first introduction of the market in mid 1990s, the majority of GMO foods, there have been concerns about food among politicians, advocates, and consumer, especially in Europe. Several factors involved that are involved. In the late 1980s and the early 1990s, the result of decades of molecular research reached in the public domain. Until the time, consumers were generally not very aware of the potential of these researches. In the case of food, consumers started to wonder about safety because they perceived the modern biotechnology has led to creation of new species. Consumers are frequently been asked, what is in for me for these risks? Where medicines are concerned, many consumers more readily accept biotechnology are beneficial for their health. In the case of the first GMO food introduced into the European market, the products were no apparent direct benefit to consumers. The potential for GMO seeds to result in bigger yields per cultivative areas should lead to lower prices. However, political intentions have focused on the risk side of the risk-benefit equation, often without discussing between potential environment impacts and public health effects of GMOs. Consumers are confidence in the safety of food supplies in Europe have decreased significantly as a result of number of food scares that took place in the second half of the 1990s that related to GMO foods. This also had an impact on discussing about the acceptability of GMOs. Consumers have questions that validify risk assessments, both with regards to consumer health and environmental risk, focusing in particular on long-term effects. Other topics debated by consumers organized have included allergicity and anti-molecule resistance. Consumers' concerns have targeted a discussion on the desirability of labeling for GMOs, falling for more information for the consumers. So more political concerns are the European Union, along with other countries, made it mandatory for GMO labeling policies for food products. The US passed a law in 2016 that will be more effective in the future of the GMOs. Debates on GMO labeling have been discussed about food policies, and especially voluntary and mandatory labeling policies for distributing if benefits and costs. Some more political concerns are GMO food labels through state level ballots and legislative effects. Major foods and agriculture corporations are opposed to mandatory GMO labeling and have successfully defeated most of these innovations. Nevertheless, the battle has gained significant media attention and re-energized the debate over GMO crops and foods. The governments and political consumerism legislator to explore movements effect for mandatory labeling, and these efforts are being industrialized through private volunteering governments. Ethical concerns and actions. FDA regulates most human and animal foods, including GMO foods. FDA makes sure that the foods that are GMOs or have GMO ingredients meet the same strict safety standards as all other foods. FDA sets and enforces food safety standards that those who produce, process, store, ship, or sell foods must follow, no matter how the foods are created. The EPA is responsible for protecting human health and environment, which include regulating pesticides. EPA regulates the safety of the substance that protects GMO plants, referring to as plant incorporated protection, that are in some GMO plants to make them resistant to insects and disease. EPA also monitors all other types of pesticides that are used on crops, including on the GMO and non-GMO crops. The USDA Animal Plant Health Inspection Services protect agricultures in the United States against pests and diseases. APHIS sets regulations to make sure GMO plants are not harmful to other plants and inspect these regulations. Some ethical concerns and actions. Ethical concerns raise perceived threats. These threats are raised include perceived threats to the integrated and intrinsic values of organisms involved, to the concept of natural order and integrated of species, and to the integrated of this ecosystem in which the genetically modified organisms occur, the GMOs occur. Several scientists' evidence that has emerged on GMOs over the past couple of years shows that there are several clear risks to human health and the environment. When genetic and engineered created GMOs or transected plants, they have no means of insertion the genes in the particular position. The genes end up in a random location in the genetic material, and its possible position is not usually identified. There are already several examples of such undesired effects being identified in the US after approval. Releasing genetically modified plants or crops into the environment may have direct effect, including gene transfers to wild relative or convected crops, weedlessness, trait effects, and non-targeted species and of other indicated effects. So some 5 ethical other concerns are potential harm to human health, potential damage to the environment, negative impact on traditional farming practices, executive corporation dominance, and the unnaturalism of technology. And here's the last video that sums up everything that was talked about in the presentation.
Low fat, gluten-free, keto, paleo, vegan, organic. You can find just about any item in the grocery aisle tailored to your food preferences, but no label is likely to cause as much debate as the one bearing these 3 letters, GMO. They stand for genetically modified organisms. We have been eating genetically modified foods in one form or another since they were first approved 25 years ago. Scientists and health agencies agree genetically modified foods are as safe as any other foods we consume, but there is an unease about genetic modification that is often fueled by how much we actually know about the science of it.
everything we eat has been genetically altered using some type of genetic technique. So what our ancestors did 10,000 years ago was primitive genetic improvement, where they would take, a wheat plant that had some characteristics they liked, they would self-pollinate it, they grow it, and they plant it, and they'd slowly start to change the gene pool through this very slow process.
The most common way scientists alter a plant is by using a soil-borne bacterium that has the ability to insert its genetic material into a plant's genome. Scientists modified that bacterium to insert a desired trait from another organism. And traits can include ones to make some crops resistant to specific insects or specific weed killers, to withstand drought or flooding, or using a fragment of a virus to make a plant immune to infection, like a vaccine.
So plants get viral infections, as do people. And so as humans, most of us, hopefully all of us, get immunized. So this is mechanistically different, but conceptually similar. Why plant breeders and farmers want to grow crops that have been, sort of immunized.
Opponents argue this isn't natural and that there hasn't been enough long-term testing to prove there are no risks to consumers.
Modern genetic approaches are no more risky than older conventional approaches. And in some cases, one could argue that there's even less risk because they are well characterized and they're regulated.
Sylvain Charlebois from Dalhousie University specializes in risk indication in the food supply system. He sides with the science, but he says there's a good reason why so many people are uncertain about GMOs.
The biotechnology industry has always been educating farmers, the industry itself, but really forgot the consumer in the end. And so all of a sudden it appeared in their foods, and of course surprises is something that consumers don't necessarily like, especially when it comes to food safety. And that's why there's been this rebellion.
You won't find a lot of genetically modified foods in the produce section in Canada. It's when you hit the processed food sections that you'll come across them. Corn, soy, canola, and sugar beets. They aren't the only genetically modified crops out there, but they're the big ones. Check the ingredients list of any number of canned or packaged foods in the supermarket, and they'll be there, often under different names. Take corn, for example. It can be there in baking powder, citric acid, caramel coloring, xanthan gum, high fructose corn syrup, dextrose, and a whole array of ingredients sometimes lumped under words like artificial sweetener or natural flavors.
75% of everything that's processed in a grocery store has at least one genetically modified ingredient. So it's really out there.
That's why there's a movement in Canada and the US for mandatory and transparent GMO labeling.
The non-GMO movement has decided to take on a leadership role in labeling, and that's why we're seeing more and more products that are labeled non-GMO, and it's been somewhat successful, even though the vast majority of Canadians don't even know what a GMO actually is. I think if you are to go with a mandatory labeling policy related to genetically modified ingredients, you would demystify the technology itself.
Right now, labeling in Canada and the US is voluntary. You won't see many products on the shelves declaring they're made with genetically engineered ingredients, but you will see plenty labeled non-GMO, often bearing a seal like this, declaring a product is verified non-GMO. It's not an official certification from any sort of government health or food inspection agency. The Independent Non-GMO Project says its goal is preserving and building the non-GMO supply chain.
So of course, GMO is meaningless and non-GMO is even more meaningless. So in the United States, probably in Canada, we have this little butterfly, and you can buy non-GMO salt and non-GMO sugar. And it's just it's a sort of a label that people are selling.
Just to give you an idea of how often this label is used, we went on a little non-GMO grocery store scavenger hunt. Here we have juices, teas, olive oil, cat food, maple syrup, sugar, and even that non-GMO salt Dr. Ronald mentioned.
Salt doesn't even have DNA. I prefer labels that are anchored to some kind of meaningful science and inspection.
There is a form of labeling coming forward in the US that scientists like Dr. Ronald are getting behind, requiring foods that are bioengineered or made from or derived from bioengineering to be labeled as such. Companies selling these products will also have to connect consumers with information about those ingredients.
You'll be able to scan and figure out exactly what it is, and hopefully that'll bring down some fear.
So this video pretty much summed up everything that was discussed in the presentation. And then, so the summary of what I learned was, I don't know, before researching more about GMOs, I don't know why I thought people were for them and I thought they were good for us. But after doing the research and stuff, I realized that people aren't for them and they're very against it, which led them to have the regulations of the labeling for GMOs. And most people don't really trust what's in the GMOs, especially with what they're putting in the crops and stuff. So that's pretty much what I learned from this. And then my references. And thank you.